Hello, my name is Thor Halfdanarson. I'm a medical oncologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Today we will be discussing how to navigate the clinical trials, and this will not be specific to neuroendocrine tumor trials, but to all clinical trials we see in oncology. So why do we do clinical trials? Well, we do it because the treatments that we give should be given not because they ought to work, but because they do work. And there's only one way to find out if they do, and that is by rigorously testing an intervention, such as a treatment, to see if it is safe or effective. The only way to do that properly is in the context of a clinical trial. So what are clinical trials expected to do? Well, they are expected to do many things, but really they are expected to test new good ideas, hoping to make a difference for patients, whether that's treatment or something else. I wanted to take you through some of the basics of clinical trials, including the low participation. So up to 40% of patients with cancer may be eligible for a clinical trial participation at some point in the course of their disease. But still, fewer than 10% end up participating in a clinical trial. But we also know that if patients are offered participation in a trial, over 50% will agree to participate. So there's definitely an interest, but the opportunities maybe not. And there's a lot of different reasons for low participation in clinical trials. So one could be that there just isn't a trial available anywhere close to you. Your provider, your oncologist, or whoever is taking care of you may be unaware of clinical trials, not used to suggest clinical trials, or just simply too busy to consider a trial. Sometimes the inclusion criteria are too strict, they don't really fit you. Sometimes there are concerns about receiving experimental therapy or placebo therapy, essentially ineffective drug. Sometimes there are concerns about the risks and side effects of a new therapy. So there's a lot of different things. But lastly, there is the concern for financial strain and time toxicity. So time toxicity is really the time spent coordinating, waiting for care, receiving care, all the time that goes into receiving care. So what is a clinical trial? Let's start by a definition. So the World Health Organization, WHO, has a definition for a clinical trial, and you can see that there. So a clinical trial is any research study that prospectively assigns human participants or groups of humans to one or more health-related interventions to evaluate the effects on health outcomes. And who does clinical trials? So institutions, cancer centers, clinics do trials. And every study is led by a principal investigator who typically is a medical doctor, but not always. There's usually a global PI or principal investigator for the trial. Let's say we have a trial that's being run across multiple different countries. There's one PI that's called the global PI, but each participating institution has its own institutional principal investigator or PI responsible for running the trial within that institution. The trials can be funded or sponsored by multiple different mechanisms, such as federal agencies, including the National Cancer Institute for cancer trials, often through what's called cooperative groups, which is really a group of multiple different cancer centers that join forces together to run clinical trials. Sometimes it's sponsored by pharmaceutical companies that contact different cancer centers individually to ask if they'd be willing to participate in the trials. Academic medical centers can have trials within a single center, and there's a whole host of other organizations that can fund and run clinical trials. So what are the reasons for doing trials? So to add medical knowledge regarding treatment, diagnosis, prevention, and more. And also to evaluate an intervention. And the intervention could be medical therapy or a procedure or a screening procedure for treating a disease. And also to discover ways to prevent a disease or prevent recurrence of a previously treated disease. So it doesn't always have to be one particular therapy. And then also, and very, very importantly, trials are done to investigate the ways to manage symptoms, to improve or maintain quality of life of patients with disease. In our instance, someone with a neuroendocrine tumor. So clinical trial participation is by far the best way to move the field of medicine forward. Without trials, there will simply be limited advances in therapy. So when is it appropriate to participate in a clinical trial? It's always worth considering to participation in a trial. But it may not always be a trial you want to do. So the trial you consider should be applicable to your situation. It should ask a relevant question that might help you or others in a similar situation. It should have the potential benefits and risks clearly explained to you, and it should be feasible for you to participate in. So who can participate in a clinical trial? So each trial has what we call eligibility criteria for patient participation. So those criteria should be clearly stated in the treatment protocol. So what are we studying? What disease? In this situation, what type of a neuroendocrine tumor is being investigated? So that be clearly spelled out in the protocol. What prior treatments are allowed? Some trials allow multiple prior therapies, others allow no prior therapies, and some allow 1 or 2 prior therapies. So you have to make sure that the trial is really a good fit for you. And some trials evaluate the new experimental treatments where there are no other good trial options. And then, are there any conditions that preclude trial therapy? So a lot of trials have fairly strict requirements regarding organ functions, such as kidney and liver function. Some of them might even have too strict criteria. And then patients who are not doing well with what we call poor performance status, including patients with brain metastases, are often excluded from trials, which is also unfortunate because some of these patients are those who perhaps need better treatments the most. So many of the trials simply just have too stringent eligibility criteria. So we need to get more pragmatic trials as we're currently leaving many patients out of trials. So let me go through a few of the clinical trial types that we have. So we have prevention trials. So now we're looking at the prevention of disease in individuals at risk. And there can be, let's say, a trial that looks at a certain supplement or physical activity, those kinds of things. Or doing a procedure to look for a cancer like colonoscopy to prevent colon cancer. Then we have screening trials. That actually fits better the colonoscopy example I just gave you. So finding disease early, treating more effectively. For neuroendocrine tumors, we don't really have a whole lot of these trials yet, but hopefully we will. Then there can be diagnostic trials. So we have a new diagnostic method. This could be a scanner, like a scan of some sort, let's say a new PET scan or a new biopsy or a new blood test, a genetic blood test, to identify better and more accurate diagnostic tests. And those are typically compared to sort of what we call the standard of diagnostic tests, just to see if the new test performs better. And then lastly, we have the treatment trial. So in this situation, we're looking at improving outcomes of patients with a condition such as a neuroendocrine tumor, looking to prolong life, delay tumor progression, or improve quality of life. We often talk about the 3 phases of clinical trials. There might be more than that, but let's just focus on those 3. So phase 1 trial, really that looks at if an intervention, such as a drug, is safe. So we test a new treatment in a small group of healthy volunteers that can be sometimes between 10 and 40 people. We look for safety, side effects, see how the body handles the treatment, and then often we treat 2 or 3 patients at a time, and we see how they do, and then we offer more patients. We're really not looking at the efficacy of the treatment. Then we have phase 2. So now we're typically looking at larger groups of patients. So looking for a signal of efficacy. So does this intervention, this drug, this new treatment, does it work? Does the dose that we identified in the phase 1 trial seem to be effective and safe? And then we gather more information on side effects and safety. And then we have the phase 3 trials, which typically are now looking at the new treatment that we've previously investigated in a phase 1 or even phase 2 trial and see how that compares to a standard treatment that's out there. So, for example, we have one treatment for someone with a neuroendocrine tumor that's been established, and now we have a new treatment, and we're comparing those two to see, is the new treatment better, same, worse, and is it safe? And typically that involves a larger number of people, so usually more than 100 in the trial, sometimes a lot more than that. And then if all of these trials sort of go through these different stages and we confirm there is efficacy, this is an effective drug or intervention, it's safe, then the pharmaceutical company or whoever is sponsoring the trial can seek an FDA approval. And ultimately, that's how we get the drugs approved. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the randomized clinical trials, because this is something that I get a lot of questions about. So not all trials are randomized. Typically, phase 3 and sometimes even phase 2 trials are randomized. So then we're comparing two different treatments. So we have patients who are eligible. We've gone through all the lists and we know that they are eligible for this trial. Then we randomize them one of two, or sometimes even 3 or 4 groups. So one would be the experimental treatment, what we're testing, and that's called the experimental arm. And then we have what we call the reference or the standard treatment or the control treatment, and that's often called the reference or the control arm. And now we compare the two groups and we see how they do. And that gets us to the next point. What are we actually looking at? So this is something called clinical trial endpoints. So all trials have to have certain endpoints. Endpoints are what the trial is supposed to measure, and they can be all sorts of different things. They can be finding the appropriate dose, the safe dose, or they can look at how effective a drug or an intervention is. Most trials have a primary endpoint, so that's the big question we're trying to answer. And then there's a whole host of little questions, well, not so little actually, they're also important, and those are called the secondary endpoints. And then we sometimes have exploratory endpoints. We're running a trial and we have this new test. We're really not testing that test, but it's the perfect situation to test like a new marker of activity or toxicity, and those are called exploratory endpoints. So let's talk about the common endpoint for a trial called the median survival. The median survival is really trying to, in many instances, look to see how long a patient lives on a clinical trial or how long a certain treatment works until it doesn't work anymore. And so it's a time from a diagnosis or start of therapy until half of the patients have experienced the event of interest, which is our main trial endpoint. And that could be tumor growth or it could be death from any cause. So these numbers really only apply to individuals. And the very common endpoints are what's called overall survival, that's life expectancy, progression-free survival, which is the time until the tumor is growing. A common endpoint for trials done after surgery is what's called recurrence-free survival. So someone has an operation for a tumor, and then now we look to see how they do after the operation until the cancer comes back. And that would be called the recurrence-free survival. And this is something that the trial has to be clearly spelled out in the protocol before we start the treatment on the study. So let me try to explain the median survival. So this could apply to, like I said, life expectancy, time to cancer coming back after surgery, or time to tumor growth. So we start with a set number of patients. So you can see the patients in the upper left corner there. So this is the beginning of the treatment. And then after a certain amount of time, half of the patients have experienced the event of interest. Let's say in this case, it's tumor growth. Now, after a certain time, half of the patients have had the cancer grow. And then when that happens, we determine the time until half of the patients have had the tumor growth or the endpoint we're interested in. That is called the median survival. So as you can see, this doesn't apply to individuals. This applies to groups of people. So it's not always life expectancy. As I said, it can be until tumor growth or recurrence, and there's a whole host of other endpoints we can look at. So let's talk a little bit about something called crossover design, because this comes up quite a bit. So patients are interested in a clinical trial testing a new drug, and you may be randomized to a standard treatment, but half of the patients get the new treatment. And people will ask me, so what if I get randomized to the standard treatment? If it doesn't work, can I go on and get the active or the experimental treatment? So again, we look at the patients, see if they meet all criteria for enrollment. And if they do, then we would obviously talk to them about, are they comfortable with this? Are they comfortable with getting an experimental therapy, or are they comfortable with getting standard therapy? And then we randomize them. So this is done typically nowadays by a computer. So it's a computer that essentially flips a digital coin of some sort and decides on who gets what. So there's an intervention, which is, in this case, let's say the experimental treatment. And then we monitor the patient until there's tumor growth or progression. And then that patient comes off study. So this is for the experimental arm. Well, what about if you get randomized to placebo or to standard therapy? It doesn't have to be placebo. It could also be sort of an established therapy. And you're on the placebo or on the standard therapy. They're monitoring you really carefully with scans, as we do on both arms every so often. But then there is tumor growth. The crossover design allows you to switch over or cross over to the experimental arm. And now the clock starts again. So now you've started the experimental drug after having completed your time on the reference arm or the control arm. So let's move on to clinical trials in practice, so how this all works for us in the clinic and for you in the clinic. So first, we got to find out about clinical trials. So where do you find out about a trial? So you ask your oncologist. If needed, get a referral to a cancer center that has a trial, and you can look for trials using search tools like the Ancora tool there, or you can just navigate to ncf.net and look for clinical trials there, which is a very useful clinical trials finder. And then you have to talk to your oncologist or your provider about the trial versus doing available standard therapy. And I'm not saying a trial is for everyone. Some people are just uncomfortable with it, or they don't have the opportunity of doing it. The trial has to make sense for you and offer you a treatment that has a chance of working. And then you have to ask yourself and your provider, if I participate in this, do I burn bridges for future therapy? Usually that's not the case, but just ask, because some trials will not allow you to get certain treatments in the future. Typically not a problem. And then what is involved if I decide on participating? Because this could be a substantial time commitment. Some trials offer financial assistance with travel and such, and some trials are now starting to do some of these things remotely. So how do we enroll patient on a clinical trial? So someone is in my clinic, let's say, has a neuroendocrine tumor, it's growing, we've been on standard therapy, and it's time to change. So we've identified a trial option. Sometimes we have systems in our electronic medical record, so the patient has been flagged as a potential trial candidate. Or sometimes the patients or the families have identified the trial, and they come to me and say, hey, tell me about this trial you have. And then we do the eligibility check. And if you don't meet the criteria, then obviously you're not eligible. Then we talk to our patients and the family and friends, and we discuss the trial to see if it's feasible. And sometimes after hearing about all the details, they say, no, not interested. And then if they are interested and meet the criteria, now they meet with the trials coordinator and sometimes a research nurse and talk about all the details. And sometimes they find out after hearing all the details that they're not interested. Well, assuming they are all interested in this, we do a final eligibility check. That may sometimes require additional testing to be run. And occasionally we find out that someone we thought was eligible for a trial is no longer eligible because we did that extra test and now they are no longer eligible. If that happens, there's no enrollment, then we'll just look at other options. If there is eligibility, so they meet all the criteria after going through all these steps, then we enroll the patient on the trial. So what happens once you're on the trial? So every trial is obviously different. They follow a very detailed protocol with like trial visit schedules, all of those things. And you can always come off the study if this is not comfortable for you or you decide that you don't want to be on the trial anymore. You can stop the trial. And then you meet with different team members on different occasions. So clinical research coordinators, clinical research nurses, clinical providers, which are doctors or advanced practice providers, sometimes learners like fellows and others who are learning how to run clinical trials. So just to wrap up, it's always worth considering participating in a clinical trial, but it has to make sense to you and it has to be something you're comfortable with. And there is no better way to advance the science and improve patient outcomes than participating in a trial. Thank you very much.